Welcome to Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Journey, Why Leaders Need It and How to Benefit from It. This is part of the DCM Associates Spring Webinar Series. We're very glad to have you with us today. We have an extra capacity crowd, and we can see you're from all over the country, which is so awesome. We're very excited. I am going to introduce our moderator, Dr. Yvonne Styles. She is Managing Director of DCM's West Coast Regional Office, hence the I'm from California girl thing. Based in Los Angeles, Yvonne is a trained behavioral healthcare professional who has spent 20 years in the nonprofit sector. Dr. Styles advocates treatment and psychoeducation as tools of empowerment for marginalized individuals, families, and communities. Her passion for social justice continues to influence her work with human service leaders, building strength through compassionate care and mental health advocacy. Yvonne is president of Styles Behavioral Services, providing consulting services, coaching, and training in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sorry, I'm trying to admit people as I'm reading this out. She is an organizationally focused, team-driven leader with breadth of experience in designing and executing youth enrichment and educational programs. Her areas of expertise are executive coaching, leadership development, strategic management, talent, and human resource management. She's experienced in all aspects of human and organizational assessment and development, and she specializes in strategic planning, staff development, organizational analysis, and operational efficiency. Dr. Styles was also former chief of staff.
Okay, thank you, Michelle.
Oh, that's good. We're good. All right, we're moving on.
Good. You're dating me with all that long history.
So sorry.
That's okay.
I'll take you to your next slide.
Well, thank you all for joining, and this is very exciting for us. We wanted to really cast a wide net today and talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as concepts that everyone in leadership should be familiar with. The goal of the webinar today, the objectives are, first, we're going to introduce ourselves through our journey of discovery. We thought the lived experience speaks volumes about why we're committed to this work. The second objective we have is to unpack some of the terms and concepts. We think everyone should be familiar with the language of difference and diversity building. So we'll do some unpacking, and then we can talk about how leaders can implement and therefore benefit through diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work and commitments. And then we'll have questions and answers. But I want to take a moment here to just say, as luck would have it, we intended to have Jim McGuirk on camera with us, but
he's on.
He's on. Okay.
He's on audio. He may not be visual, but
okay,
he's on.
I am here.
Okay, great, Jim. I'm going to introduce you now, just a moment. You won't get the benefit of his handsome face, but you will get the benefit of his breadth of experience and his depth of commitment to this area. So my colleagues, our intention is to encourage each of you and your organizations to build your capacity for success through implementing diverse, equitable, and inclusive initiatives in your workplace. We want to inspire you to value diversity and to conduct meaningful assessments and to learn to manage the dynamics of difference. In this way, you can optimize your workplace productivity and your harmony among your staff. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jim, to share about his unique journey to this path of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Jim, take it away.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and thank you everybody for joining us. Now, if this was a smaller group, I'd ask all of us to introduce ourselves. But since there's 174, we're going to go right to understanding me, because I think it's important to understand how I got the way I am today and what has influenced my particular view of the world. Now, I was raised Irish Catholic. Now, if you were also raised Irish Catholic, raise your hand in the chat room, just to show that you're paying attention. Now, I did 13 years in a parochial school. As luck would have it, I had a loving family. But you know what? We all looked the same. The families we hung around with were all the same in the way they thought about the world. We were anything but diverse. Now, my father, he was a rule-based good Catholic. But I never heard him say a derogatory statement about anyone. In fact, I was more likely to use the N-word or to tell an ethnic joke than he was. In high school, I went to an urban Catholic high school in an inner city, and the riots of the late 60s and 70s were happening all around me. That was my exposure to people of color. However, it wasn't until I went to the State University that I saw diversity in all its forms: color, ethnicity, country of origin, religion. I would see people out kicking a soccer ball, and they were from Central America. I never saw soccer where I was. Now, when I graduated college, I went to work as a childcare worker. And you know what? I realized I love working with kids and families. I saw something very important. I saw that if you treated the parents of the kids in our care with respect, they would act differently. Now, I went on to get a PhD in psychology and ended up working in one place, Astor Services, for 35 years, the last 17 as a CEO. That Astor, I learned about power and privilege. I learned how I was perceived by others and how that was influenced by their experience. And I'm going to end with the idea it was really the O.J. Simpson trial in the 90s when I saw firsthand how the color of your skin influenced how you viewed the verdict. We all watched the same thing on TV, but we had totally different perspectives. The people of color had no problem imagining that OJ was being set up. You know, for me, I thought the evidence was clear. For them, they said, no, there's no doubt that he was set up. So that was real. That was a lesson I will never forget. Yvonne?
Thank you so much, Jim. You referred to the O.J. Simpson trial, and we are currently in the post-George Floyd era, and that has also had consequences in how we view the world. I'm going to check in with Susan now. Susan Hairston, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your journey to this work. Susan?
Good morning, Yvonne. I want to thank everyone who has tuned in, and you are showing that you have a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and you want to know why leaders need it and how to benefit from it. And so when I talk about my journey to DEI&B, it's from a lived experience. I am a Black woman. I am a mother. I am a wife. I have children, grandchildren, and I grew up in a white affluent community of New Jersey that I still happen to live in. And I have experienced DEI&B from both sides of the coin when I talk about it from an individual perspective and from an organizational perspective. And growing up in a very loving family, and having some understanding that I may look different, but my village was very affirming. And it wasn't until going through that middle school time when we all know when difference really shows up, not really understanding it. And then I want to fast forward to my professional life, which is like many of you from the nonprofit community, and being very privileged to be employed in the philanthropic sector in a international foundation that makes $450 million grants out annually. And that's where my 25 years of my career was spent, in that private philanthropy world, and where I was responsible for creating an environment that was inclusive and where folks felt that they belonged and contribute, while at the same time feeling some sense of, I'm gonna call it discomfort. And through that journey at a social justice foundation, I began to understand the idea of structural racism, and also how creating an individual walk through that life. So now I happen to be a councilwoman in my town, and I feel a huge responsibility for making sure in my affluent town of Summit, New Jersey, that I am legislating from a position of power and privilege in an inclusive way, and passing legislation that laws in my local town that are beneficial to everyone. So Yvonne, I just wanted to share, I have both sides of my journey is in belonging and creating a belonging environment.
Wow, thank you, Susan. That's very powerful. So what we've established is that how we respond to this topic has a lot to do with our lived experience, the families we were raised in, the education and professional experiences we encounter. But what we know for sure is that America is a diverse country, and we are charged as leaders to create the best work environments for our staff. So now we want to move to defining what the terms are so that we have a common lexicon for this conversation we're having. Jim, can you walk us through some of the terms?
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne. And it really is important that people understand some of the basic concepts in terms of DEI&B, because it really has evolved over the years. Now, let's start with D, diversity, and that's exactly what it means. But it's in all forms: age, religion, ethnicity, gender, gender identity, skin color, position. I know in this workshop today, we have a diverse group of people attending in all different kinds of positions. So diversity is very important to understand how we differ. Equity. Now, I've worked in systems that are known to demonstrate significant bias towards specific groups. I've worked in education, special education, child welfare, healthcare. And we know how COVID did not impact all groups equally. Disparities in access to health care led to some poor outcomes, and certainly in certain communities, especially those of color. Race matters. So it's important to understand that giving everyone what they need to succeed by increasing access, resources, and opportunities for all is about equity. Inclusion. Now raise your hand if you heard the phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, it was thought it was Peter Drucker who said that, the grandfather of organizational wisdom. Turns out he probably didn't say it, but it's exactly what I think it's important. Culture is critically part of the DEI&B journey. And it's making sure we create an inclusive culture. And it's how we as leaders, what we do to create a culture where people feel listened to, where people have opportunities to express themselves without fear of reprisal. You know, as a leader, you should ask yourself, do I listen to everyone? Do you have opportunities where you go around and ask people what they're about, what their story is? That's inclusion. Now, belonging is different. Inclusion is what we do to create the environment. Belonging is how it's experienced. Belonging is how people feel about the organization and the people they work with. Do they feel connected? Do they feel valued? Are they listened to?
And Jim, I'm going to
Inclusion is
stop
what
you here. I'm going to stop you
Okay.
here because belonging is something that I thought was central to what Susan said in her opening, in her introduction. Belonging is an experiential reality when you're creating cultures of inclusion. So Susan, can you go a little deeper on belonging and how that affected your journey toward this work?
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you, Jim, for grounding us in those important concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to speak to our group here, and why they came is heavy on my mind, because I am hoping that their curiosity is how to make sure they're doing their part, because it's hard. And as individuals, we are finding out how to be a part of the organizations that we are members of, that we are leaders, we're managers, nonprofits that we volunteer, but we're also individuals who are living these lives. And it is a negative polarized environment that we're living in. And so as I want to help us be grounded in, I want to belong, and how can I create an environment where other people can belong? And it's not an easy journey. And we're going to be bouncing back and forth between institutional and individual notions of inclusion, but belonging is something that we all have a responsibility to do for others, as it is also reinforcing for ourselves. I hope that captured what you're looking for, Yvonne.
Yes, Susan, thank you. I know we've heard about the Great Resignation and how many people have left their jobs and careers over the last couple of years, spurred by the pandemic, but I think heightened by this notion of the lived experience. And belonging is, I always think, an underserved component of diversity initiatives. And so I hope as leaders, you will think through inclusive cultures and celebrate difference in terms of the workplace by making sure everyone is seen and heard and encouraged to contribute. We have some additional concepts that we need to go over. Jim, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, and we're going to just briefly talk about it. And you see the slides: power, privilege, implicit bias. And these are things that you really need to learn more about. And we'll cover that in kind of the next workshop that we do. However, they'll all come together about creating psychological safety, because I think that's important if you're going to do this work as a leader. Psychological safety, and Yvonne and I know this as psychologists, we try to create it when we work with clients, but it's really about your being able to ask questions and raise issues without fear. When you ask things, you become vulnerable with others. And psychological safety allows you to create the high-performing teams where people push each other, where they question each other, where they're able to have back and forth without fear of being made fun of or being made feel less than. So that's critically important, Yvonne.
Yes, you know, when you talk about psychological safety, Jim, some of the discordant notes that we strike at work has to do with these important concepts that you mentioned: power, privilege, and implicit bias. I didn't talk a lot about my own lived experience, but as a child, I was bused into schools and ended up being one of only 4 children in an elementary school where it was extremely isolating. But my mom, who was a stay-at-home mother at the time, decided to get a job in the school. And I felt like she was inherently attending to my sense of belonging and kind of reinforcing my ability to feel a part of the culture of the school. So Jim, you talked about psychological safety, and in the next slide, we have an explanation of what that is. We, as you mentioned, as psychologists, we know the first thing we have to attend to in building rapport is making sure that clients and people feel safe. Similarly, in the equity space, we want to pay attention to how other people feel. In the George Floyd era, there was a lot of trauma experienced by people who watched that video. And so we know that we can have vicarious trauma through witnessing aggressions, micro and macro aggressions. So Jim, you have here on your slide that psychological safety, you can ask questions and raise issues without fear. You can be vulnerable with others and be who you are, which in turn helps you connect with others. Psychological safety is what creates the most high-performing teams, where members build and learn and grow together, push back against the status quo, and innovate. So this is what we want to encourage: a workplace where everyone feels like their voice can be heard, and even when they are disagreeing. So one of the unspoken truths about a non-diverse environment is groupthink. You get an environment where everyone is in agreement because they all are having the same experience. Diverse workplaces, inclusive workplaces, allows for there to be a range of discussion, a range of opinions, a range of worldviews that ultimately makes the workplace more efficient and more productive. Next slide. So this is Jim's, did a beautiful slide here, Jim, of all of the words. It's kind of a word cloud of all of the things that we're trying to accomplish today in our time together. We want to encourage cooperation and friendship and individual unity and togetherness. And Jim, do you want to say anything else about this card? I know you can't see it, it's up.
Yeah, I see it. I have it right in front of me. But what's important is from my perspective, and it's very personal. You know, when I think about my own personal implicit bias, instead of questioning whether I have it or not, I can kind of go to my place where my goal in life from now on is to really stop racism and to become an anti-racist. And that's really my personal commitment to making sure I treat people with respect and I understand how people's stories influence how they think about the world.
Yes. So your story, to continue, I think is fascinating. Can you share, next slide, Michelle, please. Can you share a little bit about the Astor journey? Because in many ways, you were converted to an activist through your journey through the workplace. Can you share a little bit about it?
Well, and you're absolutely correct, Yvonne. It's really the journey at Astor is my personal journey as well. And actually, a shout out to an Astor person, Katie, who I hope is on there. I think she's on the list. So Katie, if you can hear me, it's good to know that you're listening. But when we think about the O.J. Simpson trial, that was in the 90s. And at that time, it was about cultural competence and understanding different cultures. And we did a cultural survey, but the reality is we didn't know what to do with the results. Now, in the early 2000s, when I was beginning my role as the CEO, it was about diversity and looking at your data. Did our boards, did our leadership map and match the demographic makeup of our population we were serving? And the reality is, when I started, we were a very white leadership team. We were certainly sensitive to marginalized populations and how cultures were different and how we had to treat people based on their culture. We had to respect it. But that was really all it was. And what happened was we brought in leadership that looked a little different than us. In fact, I remember when we hired our current executive vice president of our foundation, who was a Black Jamaican. You know, she thought differently. She gave us different ideas, and she really encouraged us to look at diversity. And it was really through her advocacy that we created a cultural diversity quality improvement team. And they told us, don't just think about your clients, think about your staff. And that led us to look internally. And we brought in the People's Institute of Survival and Beyond to learn about power and privilege and structural racism. We then brought in Annie E. Casey's Race Matters, and it made us look at our policies and procedures. Now, during the Great Recession, the work went dormant, but we brought it back, and we brought the People's Institute back, and we realized at the time, if we were going to be serious, we needed to dedicate money in our budget for this work. We needed to have people in our staff who that's their job, was to help us understand diversity in all and DEI in every way, shape, or form. And I am so happy, Yvonne, that when I left, we had the Jamaican executive vice president, I had a Hispanic CFO, a Hispanic chief quality officer, Hispanic medical director, a Black assistant executive director of our residential care. And you know what else we had? We had a director of family-driven care. And with that, we were saying to our staff that not only is your education important, but so is your lived experiences. And
Wow.
so, you know, it's pretty powerful. And Yvonne, you know what? I'm so happy that the current leader of Astor is a Hispanic, Spanish-speaking woman from the Bronx.
Wow, that is impressive. And, you know, I certainly celebrate your commitment to diversity, walking the walk as you talk it. So thank you so much. I think when you look at your timeline, and cultural competence was your kind of focal point in 1990, but I think it's important to point out that Apple, and we know the size and scope of Apple's influence in the workplace and in the business sector, they began diversity initiatives in 1996, people. And so they are leaders because they were thinking far ahead of everyone else about a globalization of the workplace and a more inclusive environment. So if you think about that, in 1996, they began. And presently, as we have this dialogue, 48.9% of children in this country is a child of color. And 4 out of 10 working age adults have disabilities and are unemployed. But 22% of our population has some type of disability. So ultimately, we're going to have to arrive at this full embrace of all kinds of people, all kinds of abilities. And thanks for your reminder, Jim. I had to rename my myself on this webinar because it's so important to indicate your gender and how you prefer your preferred pronouns. So thanks for the reminder that we're not just talking about race and ability, we're also talking about gender and the whole spectrum of the human experience. Susan, I want to go back to you now because it's nice to talk about diversity, and a lot of people are maybe thinking this is just a nice thing to do, but there are business implications and regulatory systems that people, particularly in the nonprofit sector, have to adhere to. So when you were at the very impressive Ford Foundation, I know that you were responsible for compliance issues. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of compliance in terms of diversity initiatives, particularly for
Absolutely.
nonprofits?
I would love to. That is my background, folks, and those who are in the nonprofit sector, you all know we are regulated, it seems, far more than the for-profit world, in that they've got one motive, and that's to make money, and all things lead to that road for measuring how well they're doing it. With the nonprofit sector, we have many people who are want us to be compliant, and that is our funders, that is our regulators, that is our donors, that is our constituents, those people that we serve in the nonprofit sector, and it is our employees as well. And so we have to be very intentional about DEI&B. If everyone hasn't figured this out already, and because you're here, I know you have, it's the right thing to do. It is the ethical and moral thing to do. But there is also a legal responsibility. And that is why there are ways in which, if you have a human resources or talent office, they're telling you what you're allowed to do. You know, you're not allowed to ask women, at least in our area, what they've earned, because we know that women have been historically disadvantaged in salaries. And so we have to make sure that we are having an environment that is open to disabled. And we know that there is the equal employment opportunity regulations that our attorneys make sure that we're following. So if you're fortunate to have a general counsel, legal folks on staff, they are absolutely looking at your policies to make sure that you are not unintentionally excluding folks from having equal opportunity. And so, and there are ways in which you can stay on top of that, because internally you can have your own checklists and things like that. But because of that little item that was on a very important slide you saw about implicit bias, some things we can't see because we're in the midst of. And so that's why it's good to have external, sometimes consultants. DCM does that, helps you do audits, which has you look at your practices and your policies. And then we are really advocates. You heard Jim talk about what Astor did, that they brought in the People's Institute to offer training. It's hard work, folks. And it is really helpful to have outside folks come in and make sure that you are creating an environment that allows everyone to be the best that they can be. It matters not only to yourself for your values, but also to your product, your work product, whatever that might be in your organization. Thanks, Yvonne.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much. And you know what? next slide, as we move to next slide, I guess I'll just drop this little tidbit here. Racially diverse teams outperform other teams by 35%. And here you see impact on organizations, DEI&B. So employees with a high sense of belonging take fewer sick days than employees who feel excluded. These sick days equate to almost 2.5 million worth of lost productivity each year per 10,000 workers. Jim, you want to talk through this? I think is not nonprofit. I think this came from the profit sector, these statistics.
Yeah, and Yvonne, you talked about Apple, and what we're learning is not for the not-for-profit, where you would expect those of us who work in this sector to be very sensitive to these kinds of issues, but it's really the for-profit world that is showing the real world business values, and it's companies like Southwest, LinkedIn, Costco that really are leading the way. And for those that may be from the western part of New York State, we have a grocery store called Wegmans. They've discovered the secret sauce of organizational culture. And so you see improved morale, increased retention, better recruitment, improved productivity. And what's amazing, and this is just recent research by Donald and Charlie Sull, they looked at data from 1.4 million Glassdoor reviews of 600 companies in 39 industries. They developed what they call the Toxic Five. They're the parts of a toxic culture that has caused the Great Resignation. And the culture is 10 times more predictive of turnover than salary. And Yvonne, you're not going to believe this, the most number one of the Toxic Five that predicted a poor review was inclusiveness and being non-inclusive. And so when people felt they weren't being treated fairly because of their identity, that was a culture they didn't want to be part of.
And guess what? 67% of job seekers stated that a diverse workforce was important to them. So those of us who are talent managers or human resource workers, it's incumbent that we look beyond the obvious. We have to seek out talent in all places, in all communities. And now, the older I get, the more I think about this notion of the protected class. Women over a certain age, particularly who happen to be double minorities. Very difficult for them to get hired because it's very difficult to fire the protected classes. So I was very aware how avoidant some people were in terms of hiring over 40 women and men, in fact. So let's go to the next slide. You know, here we talk about leadership, and you know, inclusion should be at the heart of every leader's strategy. As a matter of fact, DEI&B is a leadership competency that can no longer be ignored. Building relationships in a cultural context requires the full awareness of difference, and inclusion should be at the heart of your strategic management strategies. Cultural competency, as Jim alluded to, is a critical leadership skill that may not always be emphasized, but it's the interpersonal side of leadership, much like emotional intelligence. And it suggests that your inclusive policies may be at the very heart of your efficacy, regardless of your business. So, Susan, can you just share some of the highlights on this card, please?
Absolutely. I love talking about DEI&B in terms of our leadership prerogative. And I know that the larger organizations have the ability to bring in chief diversity officers, and we tend to think, oh, it's their responsibility. And but what this workshop is about, this webinar, it's all of our responsibilities to make sure that we are creating a diverse, equitable, inclusive, and belonging environment that aligns with the values of your organization, and that we are really helping everyone in our organization be a part of contributing. And you heard, Yvonne, I appreciated the statistics you gave about how it makes a difference in every area of the organization, external, internal, when you're allowing everyone to bring their best. And so we all have that responsibility. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. As we go to the next slide and as we move toward the question and answer, here are just some tips for our, the previous card said start with why. I think leaders have to spend time reflecting on the importance of this area of organizational life. Honestly assess your current DEI&B policy and whether or not it's efficacious. It needs to be done not once in a while, but regularly, routinely. And what does the data tell you? Please be vigilant about this. And let's also spend time defining and refining your organization's why. One hopes that we're growing, and as we grow, we can better articulate the need for diverse practices and inclusive policies for our teams and our staff. And at the last suggestion we make is create SMART goals for your DEI&B strategy in the same way that you create goals for other areas of your company or organization's growth. This is important. Again, Susan mentioned that DCM can consult with you. We recommend that you start with an audit. Let's look at the data, let's look at the culture, and then let's create curriculum and programs and practices that will enhance your organization's policies. Next slide. And so as we do that, what we're encouraging is that leaders build buy-in. And how do you do that? Maybe you want to have messy conversations at your organization. Encourage people to talk about their real feelings. This is not a fake it till you make it strategy. This is really about bringing people along. And you may encounter people who are just not able to adapt to this way of thinking. But let's, whenever possible, explore how intercultural competency can build toward your organizational goals and bottom lines. And let's expand our view of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging by expanding our stakeholders' interests and involvement. If you have constituents, let's get their voices heard as well. Roundtables are recommended, and certainly mentoring programs within your organization. And so now I want to open it up. Next slide, Michelle, for Q&A. As we do so, Michelle is going to let the resources and suggested reading stay up for a few minutes in case you're interested. These are some of the books that shaped us and continue to inform us on ways of thinking. So we hope that they are helpful to you as well. The next page has some articles and podcasts that we recommend. So now, if there's any questions, Michelle, we're happy to take them.
Hi, yeah, I've got a couple to start. The first one is, how do I get my organization's leadership to make DEI&B work a priority?
Jim, let's hear from you.
Well, I think it's you have honest conversations with your supervisors, and you find places where you can let people know the value of it for your organization. And then you start with looking how your clients are perceiving the organization, and you really make the connection between how it can improve not just the culture, but it can improve outcomes. And you really can make the case not just from oh, it's a good thing to do, but it will have, in fact, some positive impact on the organizational's ability to serve its clients. So you make that case and you have honest conversations with your supervisors, and you really keep it alive and you keep bringing it up. Don't let it drop.
Thank you, Jim. And you know, one thing I don't think I said, but I think is very important. Let's not be afraid to assess ourselves. You know, we have to go inside. It's an inside job first. We need to find out where we really are in this important area, and then do the work as Jim did. He talked about his 20-year journey of evolving to a person who's committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I encourage everyone to do some reflection, do some reading, and then engage in the honest conversations. And
Yvonne,
also,
Yvonne,
yes.
Yvonne, may I respond
Sure.
as well? Because
Sure.
I love that person for asking that question, because it's a courageous move if you are not a leader in your organization. And we talked about psychological safety, so that's why I love Yvonne pointing out the importance of looking within first, and then Jim giving you the strategies for how you raise it, because where you sit in the organization matters. But what you're hearing from this workshop is that we believe everyone is a part of the DEI&B journey, and especially leaders.
Thank you. You know, if the business encourages diversity and inclusion, then when it comes to finding new talent, there's so much more to choose from. It really does enhance your scope of potential staffing and leaders for the future. It's not just about recruiting a certain kind of person that looks a certain way or has a certain age or gender. It really is about finding the best people, the best talent for the positions that you're trying to fill. Okay, Michelle, any other questions?
Well, there's someone, I just have their initials AG, but I think they've raised their hand. And AG, if you've got a question, feel free to unmute and ask it.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I must have hit that by accident.
Oh, no problem.
I'm sorry.
If you saw how many buttons I hit by accident on this thing, you wouldn't feel bad at all.
I know technology hates us all.
I know. I do have another question though. One just came up on the chat. How do you suggest we encourage senior leadership to move past their hesitancy to publicize their support of anti-racism?
You know, I'm a person, and I think all three of us should weigh in on this question, but I'm a person that believes heavily in dialogue. And only through dialogue, meaningful dialogue, can you really hear the person's heart. I don't think it's just about moving senior leadership. It's really about transforming the hearts of people. And there are some people who are persuadable and some people who aren't, but we can't know that until we have a deep dive into the reasons why this is important. And I think as a country, we've avoided difficult conversations. It hasn't served us well. So I think in terms of your leadership and your senior leadership, I think creatively maybe find an ally and consider ways that you can have the dialogue at the senior levels. And maybe through a book club, maybe sharing something that inspires you. But it is work. I don't mean to suggest that it's, you know, so easy just because it makes sense. People will be willing to do it. There's going to be resistance, but that's why, you know, it behooves us all to prepare ourselves with knowledge and facts, and you know, try to become clear on what your purpose is. Susan and Jim, do you want to say anything?
Absolutely. I am so glad Quentin asked that question, because if you are in an organization that senior leadership is not talking about it publicly, it does make it, it does seem like it's difficult. And we talked about power, and we talked about sometimes if we don't feel comfortable raising it, then we're assuming that they don't want to hear it. And so I can only echo what Yvonne said about we can be find others amongst us and start walking by example. And we call them affinity groups at the foundation world. And it's where people who were interested in this topic and finding ways to talk about it and to talk about it publicly. It's so good to find out what organizations that are like yours, how are they speaking about it? Because senior leaders are worried about reputational risk. And so sensitivity to that, you can raise and increase their courage by showing how it matters to you as an employee of the organization and your constituents. Jim?
Yeah, and I think what's important to understand is if you do have a group of people that have been interested and you want to kind of have conversations with your leadership, invite them to have a listening tour and do it in a non-confrontational way, not as a complaint about what's wrong with the organization, but more about ways in which you've been thinking about these issues and how you think it's going to improve everything. Don't surprise your leadership. Let them know what you're interested in talking about, and let them know that you're interested in dialogue and you want to understand where they're coming from, and you're hoping they would want to understand where you're coming from. And I think you'll see there'll be a better appetite once you have those conversations and you create safe places for them.
You know, transforming the landscape of this country will require allyship, commitment, and information. And we're living in a time where all of that is possible. You know, the people, I was in LA during the George Floyd marches, and I have to tell you, they were predominantly my white neighbors marching through communities. So we all have an investment, we all have a stake in transforming the workplace so that everyone, you know, new arrivals to this country, you know, do we extend a hand? Do we create cultures that allow for everyone to shine? I mean, I don't know about you, but I love being able to eat different kinds of foods. Maybe you can have workplace, you know, culture day where everyone brings something. And those ways you can start to have conversations and encourage dialogue. But it does take creative commitment, you know, over time. And it does take a degree of patience. But we are, if you look at private industry and how much of their time and resources is being spent in building DEI&B programs, then you know this is not just a passing trend. This is the future of the workplace, the future of our country. So let's all recommit. I hope you can take something away from what we did here
Yvonne,
today.
I
Yes.
do have one more question
Oh,
that I
okay.
think would be.
We have a few
good to
minutes.
bring
Yeah.
out. Yeah, we have a couple minutes. And I'll only say this because someone sent it to me privately. So I think it's something that's concerning one of the participants. My organization created a VP level DEI position last year, and I currently serve in this role. How can I leverage this role to weave DEI into the work of my colleagues without creating a feeling that I'm meddling in existing work? In other words, how do I get my colleagues on board with proactively engaging my role as a resource support as problems are navigated and policies created within their departments?
You know, we talk about this a lot as consultants, and we think a lot of organizations feel just the hire itself is a demonstration of commitment to this work. We know and feel your pain. One of the things, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues as well, but one of the things I would suggest is, again, find your allies, create a strategic plan, and try to put this central to the organization. If you're siloed in human resources or talent management, then it's very hard to get buy-in from other sectors of the organization. We recommend that you cast a wide net in building your allies and then create a strategy for change. And it has to be managed. I would look at myself, if I were in your role, as the manager of culture and business strategy change. So with that, we consult on that. So please, shoot us an email if you want to do a deeper dive with the particulars. And I see someone saying create an advisory panel, but yeah, getting buy-in. Susan's nodding her head. I'll turn it over to her. Go ahead, Susan.
I'm so glad, Michelle. Thank you for raising that question up, because it is a lonely role to be in that holder of the DEI banner. And I want to applaud the organization that hired you, the leader who you report to, hopefully is a person of position and power. And they need to align you with influencers in the organization who can help you get embedded in that culture, so you're not alone. And you are creating a community that will help embed it both in the culture and in the leadership and in the individuals. It is not a solo journey. And so I agree with Yvonne's recommendation about you can see yourself as the manager of a culture, but we know that it starts one person at a time. It starts finding influencers and using your leadership.
Well, thank you so much. And Jim, we're at 11. Do you want to just add anything real quick?
Yeah, I do. Because as a former CEO, I can understand how easy it is to say, okay, I did this, let me move on to the next thing. And so I would encourage that person to continue to have conversations and set a couple of priorities, not a lot, just a couple, and make yourself a resource for the organization. Make sure you're doing things that people need and are adding value, and you do it a little bit at a time. And I think you will slowly renovate your culture in a way that you'll be happy with.
So thank you all so much. We look for us again. We'll have another DEI&B seminar. We'll do a deeper dive next time. We appreciate your attention. Jim, Susan.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again, everyone. And it is your to your benefit to keep this journey going, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Michelle.
Susan. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Michelle. It's been great.